Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we'll be exploring something that I think we all experience from time to time. Those moments when our immune systems just go a little bit haywire.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? Like, how can this system that's supposed to protect us sometimes cause us so much trouble?
Right. It's like, come on, immune system, can't you just take a break sometimes? So to really understand this, we'll be diving into a section from a microbiology textbook that talks about immune system diseases.
Sounds good to me.
So let's imagine our immune system as this incredible protector, but then sometimes it just totally misidentifies a threat or just overreacts to something harmless. That's what we're going to be focusing on today.
Right, so it's like this double-edged sword almost. It can be so precise and targeted, but then other times it's like it's going rogue and just causing chaos in the body.
Exactly. And a classic example of this is allergies.
Mm.
You know, when your immune system decides that pollen is public enemy number one.
Allergies, the bane of so many people's existence. It's like your body just completely overreacts to something that's totally harmless.
But it's not just one type of overreaction, right? Our textbook actually breaks down these hypersensitivities into 4 different types.
That's right. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of situation. You can think of it as different branches of the immune system, each with their own special way of messing things up.
Okay, so tell me more about these different branches. How do they differ in their overreactions?
Well, the first one is all about speed. It's called type I hypersensitivity, and it's responsible for those immediate reactions you see like hives, hay fever, even anaphylaxis, which can be life-threatening.
So it's like the immune system SWAT team just going in, guns blazing.
Exactly. And the key players here are IgE antibodies and mast cells. You can picture mast cells as these little alarm systems stationed all over your body just waiting to sound the alarm.
So when you encounter an allergen like pollen, it triggers these mast cells to go off.
Right. They release a flood of chemicals like histamine, which is what causes all those classic allergy symptoms, the sneezing, the runny nose, the itchy eyes.
So it's a rapid response for sure, but sometimes the response is just a little too dramatic.
Precisely. Now, the second type 2 hypersensitivity, is more of a direct attack. Here you have antibodies that directly target and attack cells in the body.
So this is like what happens when you get a mismatched blood transfusion.
Perfect example. If you receive the wrong blood type, your immune system sees those transfused cells as foreign invaders and launches an attack.
Okay, so 2 very different approaches to overreacting. What about the other 2 types?
So type 3 hypersensitivity, this one's a little bit more sneaky. It involves these things called immune complexes.
Immune complexes.
Yeah, basically they're clumps of antibodies and antigens that get stuck in tissues and trigger inflammation.
So it's not a direct attack on cells, but more like collateral damage from the immune system's response.
Yeah. Precisely. And then finally, you have type IV hypersensitivity, which is the slowest of the bunch. These reactions are delayed, they involve T cells, and they can cause things like the rash you get from poison ivy.
So to sum it up, the immune system can overreact in these 4 distinct ways, some fast, some slow, but all with the potential for some pretty unpleasant consequences. It's amazing how diverse these immune malfunctions can be.
It really is, and it just goes to show you how incredibly complex this system is. But what's even more mind-boggling is when the immune system decides to turn against the body's own cells and tissues, which is what happens in autoimmune disorders.
Right, autoimmune disorders. That's when things get really weird. It's like your body is waging war on itself.
Exactly. Imagine if your home security system suddenly started attacking your own house. That's essentially what happens in autoimmune disorders. The immune system, for reasons we don't always fully understand, loses the ability to distinguish between self and non-self.
So instead of fighting off invaders, it starts targeting our own organs and tissues. But why would that even happen?
Well, there's no simple answer. It's often a combination of genetic predisposition and environmental triggers.
So some people might be genetically more prone to these autoimmune issues, and then something in their environment like an infection or something could set it off.
That's right. And the effects can be pretty devastating depending on which organs or tissues are being targeted. For instance, in type 1 diabetes, the immune system attacks the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas.
So it's like a targeted strike against a specific organ.
Exactly. And then in celiac disease, the immune system goes after the small intestine in response to gluten.
Those are both examples of what we call organ-specific autoimmune diseases. But then you also have systemic autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, where the immune system attacks multiple organs and tissues throughout the body.
That's right. And it's important to remember that these autoimmune disorders aren't just minor inconveniences. They can have a huge impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that while we often think of the immune system as our protector, it can also turn into a formidable enemy when it goes off the rails.
Exactly. And that duality is something we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into other aspects of immune system dysfunction. It's just amazing to me how, even with all this complexity, the immune system can still act in ways that just don't make sense sometimes. But I guess that's part of what makes it so interesting to study.
I totally agree. And speaking of things that don't always make sense, let's talk about organ transplantation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible that we can take an organ from one person and give it to another, but then there's always this risk of rejection. It's like the immune system is trying to sabotage this life-saving procedure.
Well, you have to remember from the immune system's perspective, it's just doing what it's supposed to do. Its main job is to protect the body from anything it sees as foreign.
Right. So even a perfectly matched transplanted organ is still seen as an invader by the immune system.
Exactly. And one of the key factors here is something called MHC genes, also known as HLA genes, in humans. You can think of them like a unique barcode that identifies each person's cells as self.
So the closer the MHC match between the donor and recipient, the less likely the organ will be rejected. It's like finding a barcode that's as close to identical as possible.
That's a great way to think about it. And that's why finding a suitable donor is so crucial for a successful transplant. Ideally, the donor and recipient would have identical MHC genes, but that's only really possible with identical twins.
So in most cases, there are at least some mismatches, which means there's always some risk of rejection.
Unfortunately, yes. And when the recipient's immune system detects those foreign MHC molecules on the transplanted organ, it triggers an immune response.
And that response can range from mild inflammation to full-blown organ failure.
That's right. And that's where immunosuppressive medications come in. These drugs help to dampen the immune response, making it less likely to attack the transplanted organ.
But, like we talked about earlier, suppressing the immune system has its own risks, like infections. It's a real balancing act.
Absolutely. It's like walking a tightrope trying to prevent rejection while also keeping the recipient healthy overall. And speaking of tricky situations, there's this thing called graft versus host disease that can happen with bone marrow transplants.
Graft versus host disease. That sounds kind of scary. What exactly is that?
Well, in a bone marrow transplant, you're not just transplanting an organ, you're actually transplanting immune cells. And sometimes those donor immune cells can see the recipient's body as foreign and start attacking it. It's like the transplant is fighting back.
Wow, that's crazy. So it's almost like the reverse of organ rejection.
You could say that, and it can lead to a whole range of problems affecting different organs and tissues.
It sounds like organ transplantation, while life-saving, definitely pushes the limits of what the immune system can handle.
It definitely does. But before we move on, I should mention that organ transplantation isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. There are actually different types of grafts or categories of transplanted tissue, each with its own set of considerations.
Okay, so what are the different types?
Well, you've got autografts, which are transplants of tissue from one part of a person's body to another part of their own body. Like if you need a skin graft for a burn, they might take skin from another part of your body to cover the wound.
Oh, so that's why those types of grafts usually work so well. There's no risk of rejection because it's your own tissue.
Exactly. And then you have allografts, which are transplants between two different individuals of the same species. This is the most common type of organ transplant.
Like a heart transplant from a deceased donor to a recipient.
Precisely. And that's where MHC matching becomes really important to try to minimize the risk of rejection.
Okay, that makes sense.
Ah,
Are there any other types?
there are. Isografts are transplants between genetically identical individuals, like identical twins. Since their MHC genes are the same, there's basically no chance of rejection.
So that's like the ideal scenario for a transplant.
You got it. And finally, you have xenografts, which are transplants between different species, like transplanting a heart from a pig to a human.
Wow, that's getting into some pretty futuristic stuff.
Yeah.
But I imagine there are a ton of immunological challenges with that kind of transplant.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Xenografts are still very experimental because the human immune system sees those animal tissues as completely foreign. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
So while the idea of using animal organs to address the shortage of human donors is really interesting, it seems like we're not quite there yet.
Not yet, but research is ongoing, and who knows what the future holds. Organ transplantation is a field that's constantly evolving with so much potential. But for now, let's switch gears and talk about the other end of the spectrum. Those situations where the immune system is weakened or compromised. We call those immunodeficiencies.
Okay. Immunodeficiencies. That's where the immune system isn't doing its job properly, leaving people more vulnerable to infections and other problems.
Exactly. And as we touched on earlier, these immunodeficiencies can be either primary or secondary.
Right. Primary meaning they're genetic present from birth,
Mm,
and secondary meaning they're acquired later in life due to some external factor.
you got it. And the consequences of these immunodeficiencies can range from mild to very severe, depending on the specific defect.
So with primary immunodeficiencies, you could have problems with B cells, T cells, NK cells, or even the complement proteins, right? And each of those defects would lead to different kinds of vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. For example, if someone has a problem with their B cells, they might have trouble producing antibodies, which would make them more susceptible to bacterial infections.
And if T cells are affected, it could impair their ability to fight off viruses and certain types of cancer.
Exactly. And then there's SCID, severe combined immunodeficiency, which we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
It's a really devastating condition because it affects both B cells and T cells, leaving people with almost no immune protection.
Right, the bubble boy disease.
Hmm.
It's a stark reminder of how crucial a functioning immune system is for survival. But what about secondary immunodeficiencies? What are some of the things that can cause those?
Well, there are a lot of things that can weaken the immune system over time. Viral infections like HIV malnutrition and even certain medical treatments can all contribute to secondary immunodeficiency.
HIV is a classic example, right? It specifically targets and destroys a type of T cell that's really important for coordinating the immune response.
That's right. And as HIV progresses, it gradually weakens the immune system, making people more susceptible to opportunistic infections. Those are infections that wouldn't normally cause problems in a healthy person.
So it's like a domino effect where one part of the immune system gets knocked out and then everything else starts to fall apart.
That's a good way to put it. And malnutrition can also have a big impact on the immune system because it deprives the body of the nutrients it needs to function properly. It's like trying to run a car without any fuel.
So eating a healthy, balanced diet isn't just about looking good. It's also about supporting your immune system.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about medical treatments. Chemotherapy for cancer and immunosuppressive drugs for transplants, while essential, can also suppress the immune system as a side effect.
Right. It's another one of those balancing acts we were talking about earlier, trying to treat one problem without creating another.
Exactly. And that's why managing secondary immunodeficiencies often involves a multifaceted approach. You might need to treat an underlying infection, improve nutrition-adjust medications, or some combination of those things.
So it's all about finding the right approach for each individual's specific situation.
Precisely. And with that, I think we've covered a pretty broad range of immune system dysfunctions, from those over-the-top reactions to situations where the immune system is just not up to par.
It's amazing how much ground we've covered.
Yeah.
And yet it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this incredibly complex system.
You're absolutely right. The immune system is a constant source of fascination and new discoveries. There's always more to learn.
I know, right? It's incredible to think about all this intricate stuff happening inside us all the time. And when it comes to the immune system, it really is like this whole hidden world working tirelessly to keep us healthy.
Absolutely. And speaking of battles, we can't forget to talk about the immune system's relationship with cancer. It's a topic that's both fascinating and unfortunately all too relevant for many people.
Right. Cancer. It seems like everyone knows someone who's been touched by this disease in some way. So what exactly is the connection between the immune system and cancer?
Well, think about it this way. Cancer cells are basically our own cells that have gone rogue. They've picked up these mutations that make them grow uncontrollably and invade other tissues.
And theoretically, the immune system, with all its surveillance mechanisms, should be able to detect and eliminate these abnormal cells. Like, shouldn't it be able to recognize that something's not right?
Exactly. And in many cases it does. There's growing evidence that our immune systems are constantly eliminating precancerous cells, which prevents tumors from ever forming in the first place. We call this immune surveillance.
So it's like having this internal security force constantly patrolling and looking for any signs of trouble.
That's a great way to put it. But sometimes those cancer cells, they find ways to outsmart the immune system. They can disguise themselves, suppress immune responses, or even trick immune cells into helping them grow.
So it's like a constant back and forth between the immune system and cancer, each one trying to outmaneuver the other.
Precisely. And that's where cancer immunology comes in. Scientists are working to understand this complex interplay so we can develop strategies to tip the scales in favor of the immune system.
So instead of directly attacking cancer cells with chemotherapy or radiation cancer, immunology is more about empowering the immune system to do what it does best.
Exactly. It's about giving our bodies the tools they need to fight back. And there are several promising approaches out there. For example, we've already talked about therapeutic cancer vaccines. These vaccines are different from the traditional ones that prevent infections. They're designed to stimulate the immune system to recognize and attack existing cancer cells.
So it's like showing the immune system a wanted poster of the cancer cells and saying, hey, these guys are the bad guys, go get them.
You got it. And there are other approaches too, like immune checkpoint inhibitors. These basically take the brakes off the immune system, allowing it to launch a more aggressive attack against cancer cells.
It all sounds incredibly promising. But I'm sure there are some challenges involved with these immunotherapy approaches. What are some of the downsides?
Of course, there are always challenges. Cancer is a very complex and diverse disease, so not all cancers respond to immunotherapy in the same way. It's not a cure-all, unfortunately.
So it's still early days, and researchers are trying to figure out why some people benefit from immunotherapy while others don't.
Right. We still have a lot to learn, and there can be potential side effects to consider, as with any medical treatment. But despite those challenges, the progress being made in cancer immunology is truly remarkable.
It definitely gives me hope that we're moving toward more targeted and effective cancer treatments, ones that work with the body's natural defenses rather than against them.
Absolutely. And I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the immune system. We've covered so much, from those over-the-top allergic reactions to the complexities of autoimmunity to the challenges of organ transplantation and the promising field of cancer immunology.
It's been an incredible journey, really, exploring this amazing system that's both our protector and sometimes our potential enemy. And it's so clear that understanding the immune system is key to understanding so much about human health and disease.
Couldn't agree more. But even with all we've learned, there's still so much more to discover about the immune system, which I think is what makes this field so captivating. There's always something new to uncover.
So true. And before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've seen how the immune system can be both a hero and a villain. So how can we each take better care of our own immune systems and advocate for more research and education in this really important area?
It's a fantastic question, and one that we should all be pondering. After all, we only get one immune system, and we need to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep it functioning at its best. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and until next time, keep learning and exploring the wonders of this incredible system.